Reasons for back pains in flat back. One, damage to the spine's shock-absorbing mechanism. The curving structure of the spine helps to some extent to moderate shocks traveling up the spine in dynamic situations such as walking, running, and jumping, so that the direction of the shock is altered as the curves change direction. Thanks to the curving structure, the shock line in each activity that requires shock absorption is broken along the spinal canal path and thus becomes more moderate. Flat back impairs this mechanism and back pain symptoms appear. Two, damage to spinal mobility during flexion. No continual arch. In a normal forward flexion, the lumbar curve integrates with the thoracic curve. Thanks to the spinal structure, during flexion curves can be integrated, and this achieves a greater range of movement, which can be seen in a continual arch. See the video on testing the continual arch. In flat back, lower back mobility and range of movement in vertebrae L1 through 5 is limited, no continual arch, and integration of curves in flexion. As a result, sagittal movement is created with large layers that increase the load in the axis area, which is reflected in spinal flexion and extension. 3. Increasing intradisc pressure in the lower back. This aspect is connected to intervertebral disc function in the lumbar spine. Look at the structure: the body of the vertebrae, the disc, and a vertebral column. And here is the disc nucleus. Aside from its function as a shock absorber, the intervertebral disc may cause several problems as a result of its sensitivity to pressure applied to it. The anatomical structure of the spine is characterized by curves that must be protected in normal ranges. Cervical and lumbar lordotic curves create more space between the anterior sides of each two vertebrae and a narrower space to the posterior. In this way, in weight-carrying conditions, anterior directed pressure is always being applied to the intervertebral disc. During spinal flexion, disc pressure is directed to the posterior and creates pressure on the dura in the spinal canal through the posterior longitudinal ligament. In certain cases, this pressure may cause pain. Strong flexion under normal conditions. Strong flexion under conditions of straight back. What happens to the lumbar vertebrae? Flat back when standing. The nucleus is in the center. Flat back, slight flexion. The nucleus is pushed backwards, pressure on the vertebral column. Flat back, strong flexion. Strong pressure on the vertebral column. Why preserving lumbar lordosis reduces pressure on the invertebral disc? Cervical and lumbar lordosis plays an important role in protecting the posterior longitudinal ligament from increased strain and in reducing pressure on the anterior part of the vertebral joints. When the vertebrae are placed straight, one atop the other, as in flat back, a smaller degree of forward spinal flexion will create pressure on the posterior part of the disc. while the lordotic curve assures that only during considerable spine flexion will pressure be directed towards the spinal canal. This mechanism emphasizes the importance of lumbar lordosis as a mechanism that raises the threshold for posterior intervertebral pressure during flexion. This important safety mechanism does not exist in flat back, which explains the high prevalence of back pains among people with this deformation. High pressure on the lumbar spine. In light of what was said above, we see that flat back is a complex deterioration that entails functional disturbances in both the skeleton, muscular, and nervous systems. In most cases, flat back results from structural problems, and therefore, movement potential for lumbar spine flexion is smaller than normal.